The next message.
The Honorable Chris Sproul, Speaker. I am directed to inform the House of Representatives that the Senate has amended House Amendment 1, 672-415 with Senate Amendment 1, 116138, concurred in the same as amended, and passed CS for SB 1194 as further amended, and requests the concurrence of the House. Debbie Brown, Secretary. By Rules, Appropriations, Transportation, and Senator Hooper. CS for Senate Bill 1194, a bill to be entitled an act relating to transportation.
Are there amendments on the desk?
On the desk, Mr. Speaker.
Read the First Amendment.
Representative Escamani offered the following amendment to amendment with title amendment, barcode 961805, remove line 28 and insert an amendment.
Representative Escamani, you're recognized to explain the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Members, the Senate added back to this bill a controversial measure to preempt decisions made by local governments with their seaports. This is in particular really important to the city of Key West, which voted on different ordinances to help protect their environment and take more control over the types of ships that could come into their ports. We thought it was dead, but it came back. And so I filed these amendments on the original bill by Representative Roach, and I have filed them back to this version coming through the Senate. So what this amendment specifically does is it preempts to the state this measure unless a local ballot initiative or referendum is passed by at least a supermajority of 3/5 of those legally voting in the election. So the intention is to allow for local referendums that had 3/5 of their voters support a measure to make local decisions around what can happen in their seaports, for that to be exempt from the preemption. My thinking to this is that if 3/5 of voters said, hey, we want this decision, and the state of Florida should respect that decision, not preempt local governments from protecting their environment through this measure. That's the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Having explained the amendment to the amendment, are there questions of the sponsor? Are there questions of the sponsor? Seeing no questions, is there debate on the amendment to the amendment? Is there debate? Question. Let's backtrack to questions. Representative Davis, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, oh, this is your amendment. No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Davis. Are there questions? Are there questions of the sponsor on the amendment to the amendment? Seeing no questions, we're now in debate. Is there debate on the amendment to the amendment? Representative Andrade, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while the changes made in the Senate and sent over were described as controversial and made reference to a bill that we saw throughout this legislative session, I want to assure everyone on this House floor that the language that was actually put on the Senate that we are working to try and incorporate in this bill is not that language. In fact, the only language that is being incorporated into this House bill and that's being asked for the House floor to consider is the same exact prohibition on referendum changes to 10-year plans in our development orders and our comp plans that we already have in statute today that work very well for local government regulation and operation. So while I like to consider Representative Escamani a very friendly member, I would like to reiterate that this is a very unfriendly amendment, and I would ask that you all vote down.
Is there additional debate on the amendment to the amendment? Additional debate. Representative C. Smith, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, members, things are going really fast, and so you might not have realized that unless you adopt Representative Escamani's amendment, you will be overturning the results of 3 voter-approved referendums that happened in Key West. That is what her amendment does. The underlying bill is extremely controversial because we just passed an election integrity bill that talks about making sure that every vote counts and that we doubly, triply, quadruply check to make sure that they are valid. if we don't vote for Representative Escamani's amendment, we are throwing those ballots that were cast in Key West on 3 referendums in the garbage. What message are we sending, members, to say that we don't care about the will of the voters?
Members, it's getting a little too loud. I would ask that you please take your conversations to the bubble. Representative C. Smith, our apologies. You may continue. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apology accepted. But members, if you do not vote for this amendment, if you don't vote for this amendment, the person and the people who need apologizing to are the people of Key West, who will have their votes thrown out and their referendums, all 3 that happened in November of 2020, overturned completely by the legislature. Please vote for this amendment. Thank you.
Is there additional debate? Representative Hardy, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognize that this body is dominated by conservatives. I just don't know what flavor of conservative we're getting from day to day, from bill to bill. Sometimes we get our William F. Buckley conservatives. Sometimes we get our Breitbart conservatives. Sometimes we get the conservatives that read and treasure Madison. Sometimes we get our conservatives who read and treasure the Wall Street Journal and hold that up like
Hardy,
the heart.
May we please stick to the substance of the amendment to the amendment? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The point is, I can't understand why this amendment would not be accepted by true conservatives, because true conservatives believe, as Judge Bork believed and wrote, that remote government is irresponsible government. Why should a body of legislators gathered in a remote capital, legislators from around the state, have the ability to tell people in a locality how they should run their community when they have expressed their will not once, not twice, but 3 times? This is not what a conservative would oppose. Her amendment should be bipartisan because it preserves the idea of self-government, which liberals and conservatives alike should support. I appreciate the representative for bringing forward. I'll be voting for it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there additional debate? Additional debate. Representative Fine, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought I'd give the perspective of the conservative who did quite well in civics. So this is why an amendment like this should not be adopted, because it belies the entire notion of local government and local control. And I want to explain why we should do something like this. So first off, this port, we're talking about Key West, they have taken state money in order to build and support the port. So they want to take our money, well, then they should be open to us having some say over it, but that's not the important reason. See, city government is the least democratic form of government that exists. I give this speech typically once per session, but this is a great example. There is a reason that this vote happened in the city of Key West and not in the county of Monroe County. See, in order to live, I have friends who live in Key West. They look a lot like me. Because to own a house in Key West, you got to have a lot of money. It's not a place that is available to sort of regular folks to live. Most of the people who work in Key West don't live in Key West. They live in other parts of Monroe County. So who got to vote in this referendum? It's the rich folks who live in Key West. It's not the people who live in Monroe County, don't live in Key West, but own a business there. It is not, and this is the biggest issue, it is not the people who work in Key West but cannot afford.
Excuse me, Representative Fine. Members, please keep your comments. Please make sure to take your comments to the bubble. If you're going to have conversations, make sure you take them to the bubble. Representative Fine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No worries. So the idea here is the people who are affected by these things, the locals, the folks who are affected, they didn't get to vote. A small percentage of people did. And so when we're looking out for all of them, not just the people who own the wealthy homes in Key West, but the people who own the businesses who are affected by this, and most importantly, the regular folks who work in the businesses that will be affected by this. We have to remember that at the state level, everybody gets a vote. And typically at the county level, all of your activities exist at that level. But when you get down to the city, as we have seen here, many of those folks, if you say that you support the little guy, then you won't vote for this amendment.
Is there additional debate on the amendment to the amendment? Is there additional debate? Seeing no further debate, Representative Escamani, you're recognized to close on your amendment to the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And to be honest, members, this is such a fast-moving process that when I first heard Representative Audrey's response, I was like, oh man, I'm on the wrong bill. But Representative Fine assured me that I was on the right bill. And it's not appropriate for us to be preempting local governments when they make decisions, especially of such environmental importance of the Keys. We, in this body, already banned the ability for the cities like Key West and Monroe County to even preempt the use of chemical-based sunscreen impacting their coral reefs. There's already been research and data of how much cleaner the water has gotten in this part of the state. And I do respect local voters and their decisions, but most importantly, members, I care about our tourism economy and keeping our water clean, especially in such pristine areas like the Keys, is critical to their economic success. No one's going to come back to Florida if our water is dirty. And we care so much about water in this body. We talk about it all the time, but I am fearful that the influence of major corporations, especially on this issue, is impacting everyone's vision on what clean water looks like in our state. And so, yes, I filed this amendment directly because I am concerned about all of our ports, but especially the Keys. And I think that it is important that we respect the will of the voters. And so I urge you to vote up on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All those in favor of the adoption of the amendment to the amendment say yay. Yay. All opposed, no. No. And so the amendment fails. Read the next amendment to the amendment.
Representative Escamani offered the following amendment to amendment with title amendment, barcode 046421, between lines 28 and 29. Insert an amendment.
Representative Escamani, you're recognized to explain your amendment to the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm bummed out the last one didn't work out. Maybe this one will. So I mentioned the influence of money in politics before on this House floor, and it was released maybe yesterday, 2 days ago, that one of the folks who is a stakeholder in the Key West port, that is a major business owner in the area that profits off the business within the port, has made $1 million contribution through different political committees to the governor. And I'm sure they would be making gifts right now if there wasn't the gift ban on lawmakers. And I assume that when legislative session's over, folks might have checks coming their way. And so this is an amendment to address conflict of interest, because I don't think it's appropriate that money can buy off what happened in a referendum. I think the voters spoke loud and clear what took place in Key West. And so what this amendment does is that it attempts to ensure that if there's a conflict of interest with a elected official or a candidate, that the jurisdiction of such elected officials is exempt from the preemption. It's an effort to keep folks politically ethical, to the point where if they are benefiting from preempting this measure, then that preemption is moot. And that is the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Having explained the amendment to the amendment, are there questions of the sponsor? Are there questions of the sponsor? Representative Roach from Representative Schoaf's desk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be here at Representative Schoaf's desk. Representative Escamani, I just had one question. I noticed that in line 8 of your amendment, and I'm quoting here, it said a contribution that may be considered a conflict of interest would be brought to bear in the referendum. Who gets to determine under your amendment whether a conflict of interest exists?
Representative Escamani, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, this amendment was crafted very quickly, but I would assume that any Commission of Election Ethics, our Commission of Elections here, could play a role in making that decision if there is a conflict of interest based on what political contributions a candidate has accepted and where that money comes from.
Are there additional questions? Are there additional questions of the sponsor? Seeing no further questions of the sponsor, is there debate on the amendment to the amendment? Is there debate? Representative Roach from Representative Scho's desk. You're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, Representative Escamani, in presenting the amendment, talked about stakeholders. And I want to explain to you why every member of this chamber and every constituent that you represent is a stakeholder. We have in Florida something called FSTED. It's the Florida Seaport and Economic Development Program. It was created in 1990 to establish a collaborative relationship between the Florida Department of Transportation and our 15 deepwater ports. And we've codified an annual minimum appropriation of $25 million for seaport grant programs. The Port of Key West, as distinct from the City of Key West, has been the recipient of much of this largesse. FSTED right now has already invested about $1.9 million into a 5-year renovation project for Mallory Square. This is year 3 of that project. And according to the former city manager of Key West, Mr. Jim Scholl, and I'm going to quote here, the original purpose and justification for the project was to safely accommodate larger vessels and passenger-related operations. In fact, the original application for the FSTED grant includes a statement by the city that the upgrades are intended to support an annual increase in cruise ship arrivals from 338 to 363. And I say that not just to expose the hypocrisy of the City of Key West, but to make the broader point that all of your constituents in mind, in fact, every taxpayer in the state of Florida has invested money to build out the Port of Key West. So I would submit this to you. The City of Key West does not operate that port for the benefit of the citizens of Key West. They operate that port for the benefit of the citizens of Greater Monroe County and the state of Florida. And I would urge you to vote down on this amendment to keep our seaports open.
Is there additional debate? Additional debate. Representative C. Smith, you're recognized in debate on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to Representative Roach's debate, that's nice, but what we're trying to do is clean out and drain the swamp with this amendment. Everyone knows, because everyone saw it, this week the operator of a pier made a $1 million contribution to Governor Ron DeSantis. This is totally inappropriate. It's totally a conflict of interest, and this is absolutely the swamp that we are up to our necks in. The fact that someone can make a $1 million contribution to the governor to ensure that he will sign this bill into law is a disgrace. Vote for Representative Escamani's amendment to make sure that jurisdiction is exempt.
Representative C. Smith. Thank you, Representative C. Smith. Representative Hardy, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It may be true that Key West and the Port of Key West was the benefit of the state government's largesse, but the fact of the matter is that strings were not attached to that. There was nothing when they accepted that money that said that they could not continue to exercise their local democracy as they had prior to accepting it. And so the idea that after giving them the money, we now change the rules in the middle of the game, that's not okay. What this amendment is meant to do, it is meant to cut down on the influence of wealthy people. It is meant to cut down on the influence of folks who have way more ability to get to powerful people than any of our average constituents. And this is exactly the type of thing that I would expect folks who favor the little guy to support. The fact of the matter is the contribution was unseemly. And the contribution is exactly the type of activity that causes people to lose faith in our democracy at every level of government. This is exactly the kind of thing that causes people to check out. And so I support this amendment. And if you want people to be invested and engaged in our government, you should support this amendment too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative LaMarca, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was going to say that Representative Roach covered all the important stuff about the port. But being that this is the amendment to the amendment and talking about draining the swamp, I don't see Governor Ron DeSantis in this body here able to vote for this one way or the other. I don't see how anyone can make a correlation to what the back rows are talking about. But what I will tell you is if folks have a problem getting a hold of important and influential people, I would represent that Representative Escamani, Representative Hardy, Representative Sabatini, for that matter, have many more followers than probably the folks that own that pier down there. I would venture to say that we all need to vote down on this amendment. As much as I appreciate you bringing it forward, you have a lot of influence.
Is there further debate? Further debate. Representative Roach from Representative Scho's desk. Oh, correction. You've already debated. Sorry, Representative Roach. Is there further debate? Further debate? Further debate? Seeing no further debate on the amendment to the amendment, Representative Escamani, you're recognized to close on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's good to know that folks think I have influence because being in this back row does not feel that way. But seriously, members, it is such an important amendment for folks to consider. We are trying to drain the swamp. We are trying to drain the swamp. And yes, Representative LaMarca, the governor, is not in this body, but if this bill passes, it will go to his desk, right? And of course, there are members here that also need to think about how they're voting. Are you voting because it's in the best interest of your community, or are you voting because someone wrote you a check? I mean, candidly, that's a question I think a lot of people ask themselves every single day in this process. With COVID-19, we don't have lobbyists outside in this rotunda, but usually we do, right? And that's a constant question that folks are asking themselves. And what I want you to think about is which weighs more, right? Should $1 million donation to the governor beg him to vote?
Representative Escamani, please make sure to stick to the substance of your amendment to the amendment. Remember, we're in the Florida House. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will wrap up. Just to weigh those two, right? This is the will of the voters versus some major special interests, and I'm siding with the voters. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
Having closed on the amendment to the amendment, all those in favor of the adoption of the amendment to the amendment say yay. Yay. All opposed, no. No. And so the amendment fails. Seeing more than 5 hands, the clerk will unlock the machine and the members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? The clerk will lock the machine and announce the vote.
38 yeas, 75 nays, Mr. Speaker.
Show the amendment to the amendment fails. Read the next amendment to the amendment.
Representative Smith C. offered the following amendment to amendment with title amendment, barcode 180773, between lines 28 and 29, insert an amendment.
Representative C. Smith, you're recognized to explain your amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I know that some previous amendments earlier today I wasn't quite ready for, but I woke up this morning ready for this amendment. This amendment will require that when a local ballot initiative or referendum that is canceled by the underlying amendment, that the local jurisdiction, well, really the state of Florida will be required, if the underlying amendment passes, to issue a legal notice in a newspaper of general circulation in the local jurisdiction in which the referendum passed, and also via direct mail to each voter who cast a ballot in that referendum that's been canceled. And they will essentially let them know that the previously approved ballot referendum that they voted on has essentially been rendered void. We also prescribe the exact language that we are requiring the state to publish in a local newspaper in Key West to notify them of what we have just done here. And this is the text that will be required to be printed in a local publication and directly mailed to voters who participated. In 14-point bold type, the legal notice must list the following text: by the order of Governor Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature, that's you. And despite voters' overwhelming approval at the ballot box, the state of Florida has determined this local ballot initiative or referendum is null and void. Your vote on this local law is now void. That is the amendment.
Having explained the amendment to the amendment, are there questions of the sponsor? Representative Soroy, you're recognized.
Thank you, and good evening, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative, for the opportunity to pose a question. The way that I read your language regarding the notification that should be mailed to voters, it references by name Governor Ron DeSantis. And I'm curious if you could tell us, assuming he is elected President DeSantis, 5 years from now, will the legislature have to come back and insert the name of the new governor to correct the language of your amendment?
Representative C. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This language is intended to apply specifically to the underlying amendment and the underlying referendum that has been null and void.
Are there additional questions? Are there additional questions of the sponsor? Representative Fine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just had one question, Representative Smith. Can the public notice be done online, or does it have to be printed in the newspaper?
Representative C. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Fine, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me double check here. Okay, I'm looking at legal notice in a newspaper of general circulation in the local jurisdiction. Okay, so if it makes you feel any better, we're not requiring that it be printed. It could be an online publication based on my read. So if it makes you feel more comfortable that it doesn't have to be printed, that it can be posted online, that we have just voted to cancel the results of 3 referendums in Key West, I suggest you vote yes on the amendment.
Are there additional questions? Are there additional questions of the sponsor? Seeing no more questions of the sponsor, is there debate on the amendment to the amendment? Is there debate? Representative Andrade, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Based on the line of questions and answers just now, it's my understanding that the amendment is not actually what the amendment sponsor actually intended to incorporate into the underlying bill, and for that reason, I'd ask everyone on the floor to vote down on this amendment.
Representative Escamani, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I love this amendment. I think it is communicative. I think it is important for us to let the voters at least know what we're doing here in this body. And of course, assuming the governor were to sign it, that his name is also attached to it. So I love this amendment, and I thank Representative Smith for his creativity and flexibility and meeting the needs of folks like Chair Fine in ensuring that we try to find common ground in how this notice should be delivered. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Democracy should not die. This legislative body and the governor should not team up to kill local democracy. But if local democracy should die, it shouldn't die in the dark. And what this amendment does is it ensures that when this legislative body works together with the governor to cancel local democratic efforts, that we have to at least tell them what it is that we've done so that they can have an opportunity to hold us accountable. It has been said that there's nothing less democratic than local government, which is strange given that many of them, which is strange given that many of us in here, including myself, come into this body from highly, highly gerrymandered districts which frankly allowed the legislature to choose our voters rather than giving our voters a real chance to choose us. So I think that we should preserve local democracy, and I think that if we're going to do the sorts of things that this underlying amendment would do, we should at least be required to let voters know what we have done to their democracy locally. Thank you.
Representative Daley, you're recognized in debate on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief. Like Representative Escamani, I love this amendment. And as a matter of fact, I'd love to see it added to every single preemption that we do in the state of Florida. I have never met a politician, regardless of your side of the aisle, that doesn't want to take credit for something they've done. So members, if you love this bill and you want to support it, gosh darn it, take some credit for it and vote up on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Additional debate, members. Is there additional debate on the amendment to the amendment? Seeing no further debate on the amendment to the amendment, Representative C. Smith, you're recognized to close on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate people, cutting up on the floor and, making clever remarks and clever jokes. But look, the issue of canceling 3 voter-approved referendums is actually a serious matter. You shouldn't be laughing about what you're about to do in the underlying bill. Okay? Let me address the technical questions that have been asked. I was just asked and questioned, well, what if Governor Ron DeSantis became president? Don't we have to update the language? No, because the amendment only applies to the underlying section. It says it right here on line 7 of my amendment. It says, if it's expressly preempted to the state by this section. We're only talking about one section. We're not talking about all these other future referendums that will now not pass because of the underlying bill, which says that they can't even have a referendum. So no, it doesn't have to be changed because it only applies to 3 referendums. The 3 that passed in Key West, which you're trying to cancel in the underlying amendment. And let me remind you of what those 3 referendums were. All 3 were in November of 2020. They weren't a long time ago. Voters didn't just change their mind. Oh, that was the 90s. Things were different back then. It was November 2020. It was a few months ago that they did this. A few months ago, by 63%, they passed a referendum limiting cruise ship visitors and the size of, or the number of visitors that would be allowed to come through a very small jurisdiction of Key West. By 61%, they passed a referendum limiting the size of cruise ships to try to protect the coral reef. And by 81%, voters approved giving docking priorities to cruise ships with the best environmental and health records, 81%. So really, the purpose of this amendment is to make it crystal clear, since the water over the coral reef will no longer be crystal clear to the voters, that this is what Governor Ron DeSantis, when he signs the bill, and what the Florida legislature has done. You have canceled the results of all 3 voter referendums. You obsess over election integrity. And then when voters send a message, they follow the rules, they pass a voter referendum on the issues that they care about. You swoop in and you say, I don't care what you want. I'm canceling your vote. Members, that is absurd. That is absolutely offensive. It's an attack on our democracy. Vote for this amendment so that at least we can be transparent about the attack that we're about to launch on Key West voters. Thank you, members.
All those in favor of the adoption of the amendment to the amendment say yay. Yay. All opposed, no. No. And so the amendment fails. Seeing more than 5 hands, the clerk will unlock the machine and the members will proceed to vote. Will proceed to vote. The members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? The clerk will lock the machine and announce the vote.
39 yeas, 76 nays, Mr. Speaker.
Show the amendment fails. Are there additional amendments to the amendment?
None on the desk, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Andrade, you are recognized for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to concur in Senate Amendment 116138 to House Amendment 672415 to CS for CS for CS for SB 1194.
Representative Andrade moves the House concur in Senate Amendment 116138 to House Amendment 672415 to CS for CS for CS for Senate Bill 1194. Representative Andrade, you are recognized to explain your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment to Senate Bill 1194 incorporates a prohibition on the use of local government referendums to restrict commerce at Florida seaports. To remind everyone on the House floor, this is the same type of restriction that is already ingrained in statute for comprehensive planning and development orders. This is not the same ports bill that has been highly derided throughout this session. This does not preempt local government bodies like city councils, county commissions, port councils, or port operators from incorporating any type of regulations they so desire. And that is the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Are there questions of the sponsor? Are there questions? Representative Wilhite, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, you just said local elected officials. Is that if there is a local official, a municipality, but there is a port in that municipality, who has the governing authority over this?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Assuming the municipality owns that port, the city council of that municipality would have control over its operations.
Representative Wilhite, you're recognized.
No, the port is within the municipality, but there are elected members of the Port Authority. So then would those Port Authority members have the jurisdiction over that port?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Yes.
Representative Wilhite, you're recognized.
Would it matter? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would it matter if that Port Authority took any state tax dollars or not?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
On whether or not they have the established jurisdiction in statute, the authorizing statute for that, I guess, local port authority of elected members, this amendment does nothing to change how they operate, regardless of whether or not they accept state funds or not.
Are there additional questions? Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I am deeply concerned about the integrity of local elections, and I wonder, what do you think this amendment will do to the integrity of the local elections that determine the issues in question here?
Representative Roach from Representative Shostest, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Harding, for that question, which I am glad that you asked, because I wanted to talk about this. We've heard a lot tonight about this so-called free and fair election that happened down in Key West in November, height of COVID, when people were home. And I want to talk about that election real quick. So during this election, there was not one public meeting held. There was not one panel discussion held. There was not one working group. There was absolutely no avenue for public input. And I want to tell you what's really going on here. I'm going to cut to the chase and give it to you straight. What's really going on here is you have a cabal of wealthy landowners in Key West that don't want what they consider cruise ship riffraff walking down their pier. And if your only way to get to Key West is with a $300 weekend pass on Carnival Cruise Lines, those aren't the type of people that they want in Key West. And this came up in the Senate testimony when they had the working group. One of the proponents of this bill, one of the organizers, let the mask slip for just a minute and talked about the kind of type of visitor they want in Key West. And one of the senators that represents Monroe County actually lit them up on this. So I would challenge this so-called election when most of the working class citizens that populate these blue-collar jobs didn't have a vote. And furthermore, I think that Florida's tourist economy should be open to all Floridians, all Americans, and all international visitors that want to come participate in our tourist economy.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm curious. Representative, you said that there was no opportunity for public input, but is not the election that we're discussing the opportunity for public input?
Representative Roach from Representative Shostest, you're recognized.
Thank you. I return to my comment earlier during an amendment about stakeholders and who should be voting in these elections. I don't think, when you talk about siding with voters, I'm siding with workers, and I would submit that a free and fair election on this issue should be decided by every stakeholder, which would include every resident of Monroe County and every citizen of the state of Florida.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that rationale. But where do we draw the line then? If we say that anyone who has a stake in an issue should be able to have a vote on the issue if the election is to be held around the issue. I mean, don't we have these things called borders? Shouldn't we protect our borders, and the border of Key West should matter? Where do we draw the line, if not at the border of the community that is most severely impacted by the issue in question?
Representative Roach from Representative Shostest, you're recognized.
I do like borders, Representative. You know, you bring up an interesting point, and you know, I would say this: we don't have to draw that line. That line has been drawn for us, and the reason that we're preempting this is because there's been a line drawn in the U.S. Constitution that says the ability to regulate commerce is preempted, or it's expressly spelled out in Article 1 of the Constitution, to Congress. So I would submit to you that when we joined the Union back in 1845, that's the 27th state, we made a commitment to this federal government that we would honor the Constitution. And not 10,000 voters, not 100,000 voters, not even every single voter in the state of Florida voted for something that was unconstitutional. We have to honor that commitment.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you. That is an interesting rationale for this amendment, being as you're basically saying that the regulations that these local governments. So let me just make sure I get this clear. Are you saying that the regulations that local governments place on ports in their community somehow violate the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution?
Representative Hardy, would you care to rephrase your question? Please make sure to stick to the substance of the actual amendment. You're recognized.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand the representative's statement rationalizing the amendment. And it had to do with the United States Constitution. And so, I should ask, what about the Commerce Clause is implicated in this local government's decision to impose a regulation on this thing which affects their community most proximately?
Representative Roach from Representative Shostas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, I'm not rationalizing it. I'm just telling you what the law is. And this goes back to a Supreme Court case in 1824 that John Marshall decided. It was called Gibbons versus Ogden. But I'm going to give you some other references. I think there are really four sort of constitutional plays here, and I want to tell you what they are. The very first one, we go back to the document itself, and I'm going to quote it. The Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. The second thing that I would look at, in addition to the actual Commerce Clause in the language of the Constitution, is a judicially created clause which has come to be known as the Dormant Commerce Clause. And that means that because Congress has been given power over interstate commerce, states cannot discriminate against interstate commerce. So if states can't discriminate, it bears to reason certainly that a city with 25,000 people on it at the southernmost point of the United States can't discriminate. And third, I would say that the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently, a large body of precedent here, determined that federal supremacy principles mandate preemption of efforts of state and local governments to impose conditions on port entry that federal laws already cover.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I won't mention the so-called big tech bill, which probably wades into these issues which belong to the federal government. But, may I ask, why is it that the state is taking it, why are we taking it on ourselves to guard the jurisdiction of the federal government here when there's a perfectly working judicial system? I mean, if this is really an issue, couldn't the companies that are affected by this take this to federal court and have this issue settled here? Why are we presuming to understand how the courts would handle this issue if it's truly, some sort of violation of the Constitution?
Representative Roach from Representative Shostas, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been two lawsuits filed on this issue. The second lawsuit, a judge ruled, and I think he ruled correctly. He said the case, and I quote, was not constitutionally ripe. And the reason the judge ruled that way when he explained the opinion is because at the time, and still to this date, the CDC, the federal government, which I said preempts here, has issued a no-sale order, which is still in effect. Many of you have seen in the news that the governor, through the Attorney General of the state, has sued to rescind that order. But he said this is not constitutionally right. But I would submit to you that any second-rate legal intern could tell you the second that a cruise ship attempts to pull into the port of Key West and is denied entry, that case becomes constitutionally ripe and will be overturned. But I know the question is, okay, why not just wait and let the courts hash this out? And I'll tell you why. A case like this is going to cost millions of dollars in litigation and probably at least 3 years to litigate. That's 3 years with a negative $90 million direct revenue into Key West and about 2,000 jobs gone for a 3-year period that it takes to litigate this case. And also, I would say that this legislature, this body, has a responsibility when we acknowledge something that's unconstitutional or a conflict of law issue. We don't need to punt. We don't get to punt. We're going to address it here because the Supreme Court of Florida and the federal Supreme Court, they are charged with being the arbiter of the Constitution, but equal branch of government, every co-equal branch can interpret the Constitution, and I submit to you that we should do that.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the state a branch of government?
Representative Hardy, would you care to rephrase your question? Thank you. Representative Learned, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Representative, in your question. I'm just a little confused in your answer to all the questions. We obviously keep talking about Key West, but this bill affects ports statewide. Can you explain why the focus on Key West?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Learned, to be quite frank, I can't. This bill is the same exact language that we have imposed on our development orders and comp plans in every other context. So while I think you have a lot of people who are very concerned about one very specific port, I can't really explain exactly why each different person cares so deeply about that one circumstance.
Are there additional questions? Additional questions of the sponsor? Representative C. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suppose either one of you can answer this question if you're able to. Have you talked to any of the local fishermen in the area about how they feel about this? I know you said that there was allegedly limited public input when the referendums passed.
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Well, I think it's a little bit unfair that I field these types of questions when I can't ask the same question to the back rows, but the answer is no.
Representative C. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Representative Andrade. If the rules were more lenient, there would be more time and I would be here to answer questions all night long. But my question still, because Representative Roach has alleged that there was very limited public input, I saw in the committees where this bill was heard that dozens and dozens and dozens of people drove all the way from Key West, fishermen, people who worked in the area, folks from the industry. They were opposed to the bill. Have you addressed any of their concerns?
Representative C. Smith, would you care to rephrase your question? Remember, please stick to the substance of this amendment. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rather than rephrase it, I think I'll just ask about a related issue since the sponsors don't want to talk about opposition in the area where it's impacted. I want to ask you specifically about really economically what's happening in Key West right now. Of course, the entire state has struggled economically due to COVID-19. Is the Key West area, are they struggling right now economically, and do they desperately need to invite these gigantic cruise ships that will destroy our coral reef?
Representative Roach from Representative Show's you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Smith. So if this referendum is allowed to stand, it's going to stop 94% of the cruise ship traffic from entering the port of Key West. In 2022, this coming year, the Key West right now has 287 what they call firm reservations for cruise ships of all sizes. Of those 287 reservations, only 18 of those ships would be able to enter the port of Key West if this referendum were allowed to stand. 269 ships would be excluded, reducing the amount of visitors to Key West by about 1 million per year. What that means, members, is that 1 million people who want to visit the state of Florida and Key West would be prohibited by law from doing so. It would reduce cruise ship passengers overall by 99%. A total of 12,800 jobs were sustained by visitors to Key West in 2018, about 9,000 direct and 3,700 indirect jobs. Up 71% of all jobs in the Keys are sustained by tourism. Key West tourism generated about $200 million in tax revenue in 2018, with $110 million of that going to state and local governments. The Key West Chamber of Commerce has estimated, and I quoted this figure earlier and I've done it in committee, a $90 million annual direct loss of income and 800 jobs related just to the cruise ship industry. And that's not counting the ancillary businesses. And I want to tell you how the economy is doing, because what you're going to hear from proponents of this referendum is that the economy is doing great in Key West. This is how great it's doing. The Hemingway House, which many of you may have visited, has experienced a revenue decrease of 35%. The Hemingway House retail store has gone bankrupt. The Butterfly Conservancy is down by almost 40%. The Butterfly Conservancy retail store has closed after 25 years of operation. And the Mel Fisher Museum, one of my personal favorites as a lifetime mariner, is down by 50%. So I would submit to you that, yes, the economic impact here is dire and critical, and we are talking about putting real people out of work that are putting food on their table, and I ask you to help me correct that.
Representative C. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although there's always opportunities to improve, I just want to point out that the state's second lowest unemployment rate is for the Key West region as we speak. So my question is about the evolution of the size of cruise ships, because this preemption on referendums, I mean, it doesn't just cancel the 3 voter-approved referendums from November. It prohibits any new one from coming in the future at any point. So are cruise ships getting larger over time and more capable of destroying the environment around them, including our precious coral reef, which is the 3rd largest barrier reef on the planet, or are the cruise ships getting smaller over time?
Representative Roach from Representative Schoaf's desk, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would argue they're doing both, actually. They're continuing to build smaller cruise ships, and they're building larger ones. And if this referendum is allowed to stand, the best and most economically clean cruise ship that we have in the world would not be able to enter the port of Key West. It would not meet the requirements. So when you're talking about environmentally safe cruise ships, I think it's a fallacy to think that just because they're smaller, they're better. That's often not the case. The larger ships, the new modern ships, are actually the best in terms of environmental records and economic cleanliness. So I hope that answers your question.
Representative C. Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Representative, for answering my questions. I was going to ask, why did you make the bill retroactive? But, you know, based on this dialogue so far, it's obvious, because the intent you've declared is to overturn those 3 voter-approved referendums.
Representative
so
C. Smith, is there a question? That sounds more like debate. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence. You know I'm a bit long-winded here, but I guess I'll just ask you this. Since you feel so strongly about the 3 voter-approved referendums in Key West, did you travel down to Key West to oppose them before they passed?
Sorry, Representative C. Smith, would you mind repeating that question? Yeah, for me.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll repeat it so that everyone can hear. Since you feel so strongly about overturning these 3 voter-approved referendums in Key West, did you at any point before they passed travel down to Key West to oppose them and be part of the public process?
Representative C. Smith, do you have another question, one that is regarding the substance of the bill? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No further questions.
Are there questions of the sponsor? Representative Stevenson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. The Representative Andrade, do you know what year the Key West port was established?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since this amendment applies to all 15 of our naturally deep water ports, the only age of a port establishment in Florida that I know is my own Pensacola, so no.
Representative Stevenson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a natural deep water port. It's been around for a long time. And I don't know how much money we've invested there. This is a question, so I'll try to stick to questions. My understanding is 1821 was the establishment. How many ports in Florida have had local referendums regarding the port traffic?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Based on a cursory search, several. The only one that I know of where the local referendum actually restricts maritime commerce would be the referendums located in Key West.
Representative Stevenson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Do you think there is anything unique about the Port of Key West and the size and scale of the traffic as opposed to the port landing?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Stevenson, as a lover of all things transportation, including seaports, and as a lover of the state of Florida, I would say that all of our ports are unique.
Representative Stevenson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Are there any other ports that are have a submerged protection area around them with unique corals that are threatened by siltation suspended in the water from the large cruise ships that are trafficking in that area?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
To answer your question slightly more broadly, I think that there's no doubt that a lot of our ports, I know that my port of Pensacola has significant ecological concerns that are being addressed in all the different unique ways each Florida specialist port, addresses them. As far as the specific federal protections that you're referencing to the Port of Key West, no, I'm not familiar, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head if each one or if any other one has the same protection.
Representative Overdorf, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just a dumb biologist, and I just want to bring us back to all 15 and seaports and stuff. And you had alluded earlier, and I just want you, if you could explain a little bit more. As I understand it, this refers to referendums, but if my local government says, I don't want to have commerce, or I don't want to stack whatever it may be really high, I want to pass a resolution about that, this in no way restricts that local government from doing that particular action. Is that correct?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Overdorf, no, this amendment in no way restricts a local government body from incorporating any type of policy they would like related to their seaports.
Are there additional questions? Representative Schlossberg, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So earlier you told Representative Hardy that the ballot initiative was in conflict or violated the Dormant Commerce Clause. But if that's the case, then how could we preempt those issues to the state in lines 27 and 28 of the amendment?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Would you mind kind of rephrasing your question? Because, I mean, obviously, powers can go up, and the term is preemption. Powers can go down, and I'm not exactly sure what that term might be called. But can you rephrase that question and explain exactly what you're trying to ask as far as what we can regulate as a state?
Representative Schlossberg, you're recognized.
About 5 minutes ago, Representative Roach had said that the Dormant Commerce Clause was violated by the referendum that was passed in Key West, that those powers are expressly can only be addressed by the federal government. So if that's the case, how can we, on line 27 and 28, how could we say that the initiative is prohibited, void, and expressly preempted to the state?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Schlossberg, forgive me for my confusion. I'm pretty sure you voted for that Tobacco 21 bill earlier today that's already been preempted by the federal government. So I'm not exactly sure philosophically where you're driving towards on this argument, but the state can absolutely preempt
Representative Andrade, please stick to the substance of the amendment. Representative Roach from Representative Scho's desk, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Representative Schlossberg. I think that's a sincere question, and I want to give you a good answer. Yes, I will stand by my statement, and it's not just my statement. I mean, this is the law. That federal law controls the regulation of maritime commerce, and I would submit to you that if the state of Florida passes a law in this body signed by the governor which banned cruise ships, we are in violation of the U.S. Constitution, and a federal court would overturn that. So I don't think a jurisdiction can do it. I don't think the state can do it. And just by preempting something to the state doesn't mean that we're taking a regulatory action. If we preempt it to the state and we act within the constitutional guidelines that we have, we're not in violation of the Constitution. But no, I think you're correct. I think if the state did the same thing that Key West is attempting to do here, I think we would be in violation of the federal Constitution.
No, we had Representative Escamani. You're recognized for a question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be brief. I know we've had a lot of questions already, but just hearing some other questions around local governments still being able to decide what traffic happens in their ports. In the case of Key West, my understanding is that the local governments support the referendum, so they already have that buy-in. So why do we need this amendment if it's going to stay the same, if that's what your intention is for local governments to have control?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
If that local government body wanted to actually put pen to paper and go on the board, they're more than welcome to do so.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Well, you know what? Let me ask you this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following up on Representative Schlossberg's question, the preemption itself seems to express that we have an authority that you admit we don't have, right? And so you don't find anything problematic with the idea that we preempted this issue from a local government up to the state just because we haven't used the authority that we're saying in the preemption belongs to us?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'm not quite sure exactly what that question's trying to get at, because all this amendment does is the same thing we've already done in our development orders and comp plans that I've not seen any type of movement to try and roll back. We already have a preemption from referendums changing our development orders and comp plans, and I haven't seen much objection to it. So I'm a little bit confused about where the missing authority is, or the massive concern about the policy itself.
Representative Hardy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just following up, right? So this bill preempts local governments that have had these referenda. And one of the rationales stated for this preemption is that the local governments are exceeding their authority, not just their authority given to them by the state, but the authority that, frankly, they would have under the United States Constitution, because supposedly this stuff is to be left to the federal government because the federal government regulates interstate commerce. Now, in response to a question from Representative Schlossberg, it was stated that, well, yes, we're preempting the authority, but we haven't used the authority that we preempted. And so you don't find the kind of implicit statement here that we have this authority to preempt, you don't find that at all problematic, that basically we're trading a local violation of the Commerce Clause for a state violation?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hardy, while I reject the premise of your question, the short answer is no.
Are there questions, further questions? Representative Wilhite, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for a second chance here. I was wondering on line 21 if you could just explain to me your rationale for what environmental and health records are. Who would be requesting that and those records, and what would constitute them not allowing them or allowing them? Can you just give me an understanding of what that means?
Representative Roach from Representative Scho's desk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Wilhite. Yeah, I want to answer that one. So the referendum that passed on November 3rd, there were 3 referendums. The third one, when the city of Key West was amending their charter, and as these directives told them to, the third referendum was to give preference and priority to cruise ships and cruise lines that had the best environmental record. So that's where that preemption language comes from. And I'll just tell you that the way they were attempting to do that was very problematic, because they were essentially outsourcing the determining factor. Right? A lot of times it's not the decision; it's who gets to decide. Right? Who gets to decide who has the best environmental record? So they were outsourcing this to some an online survey thing, like a Google survey or something, which could easily be manipulated. So you could sit at home and punch the button and downgrade a ship's environmental records. To me, that was extremely problematic, that we would outsource that to a non-governmental entity, which could be manipulated by pretty much anyone. That's why that preemption language is in there.
Representative Wilhite, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just last question, if you don't mind indulging me. If this is preempting that referendum that's already in place, if there were already any contracts that were signed and put in place, what would happen to those contracts if they had any? Does this preemption supersede any of those contracts?
Representative Andrade, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Wilhite, because this referendum effectively killed an entire industry, my assumption is no new contracts were drafted after its passing. I would venture to guess that a large majority of contracts were actually killed and interfered with by the referendum.
Are there questions? Questions of the sponsor? Are there additional questions of the sponsor? Seeing no additional questions of the sponsor, is there debate? Is there debate? Representative Mooney, you're recognized in debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I've heard some great questions here this afternoon, or this evening, I guess now. We've been here all day. While I appreciate this bill as a whole, I have to tell you that living in Monroe County, which I will say this very clearly, is an area of state critical concern that I've lived underneath my entire life. It was initially something that was very difficult to deal with when DCA was around and we were being controlled by every ABC known to man. Ultimately, we found out that DCA was actually right. The DCA actually did what it was supposed to do that time, and that was to save us from ourselves down there. And what I hate most about this process right now today for me is that there's a very good transportation bill in here with my personal opinion is should this have never gotten here. This amendment should have never gotten put in here. It's not good for anybody in the Florida Keys. I will tell you in undeniable terms that the city of Key West, the city of Marathon, the city of Key Colony Beach, the city of Alamorada, Monroe County, the National Marine Sanctuary, and all the other scientific communities within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary boundaries are opposed to this bill. This amendment. They were opposed to the bill, and while we may or may not like the referendum for whatever reasons it may be, the citizens of Key West did in fact have the opportunity, and in fact they really have not completely killed the cruise industry. While certainly it's going to be difficult to fill those voids, and I know that they're actively hunting for cleaner, safer cruise ships, and I'm still not sure how. Again, as Rep. Roach just finished saying, is that that's not necessarily something that's going to be easy to do, but where there's a will, there's a way. Maybe it changes the cruise industry for all we really know. I don't know about that. But because I live in Monroe County and rep the citizens of Monroe County and Key West, it's important that you understand that water quality is our lifeline there. And whether anybody likes cruise ships or don't like cruise ships, that's an opinion, it's yours. That's my personal opinion, and I keep it to myself. But the reality of it is that the fishermen that did come up here, and I've known their fathers, I fished with their fathers, and the water's gotten better. I've been there when the cruise ships come in. There's no question turbidity is really bad when those cruise ships dock. You cannot see for hundreds of yards. And I don't have to tell you that when turbidity is bad, fishing really is bad. And it's bad for the ecosystem. But when the National Marine Sanctuary says that it's hurting our reefs, you really have to listen to that because they've been very, very aggressive on protecting the natural reefs of the Florida Keys and the United States of America. Honestly, it's a bad bill. It's a bad amendment. And as much as I hate to stand here and go against my fellow Republicans, and it's not personal, it is my job to protect the ecosystem of the Florida Keys, and that's what I'm going to do. And so I would urge you to think twice, and if you come back to the table next year. I've heard it 100 times while I've been here. Every bill takes some time to get through the process. Sometimes you have to kill a bill to make it better, and that's what we have to do. That's what we have to do. But I will say it again, that the waters of the Florida Keys are the lifeline of the Florida Keys. Regardless of how the visitors get there, regardless of how they enjoy it, those waters have to stay pristine. Because when that reef dies, the state of Florida will die with it. And with that, I close.
Further debate. Is there further debate, members? Additional debate? Seeing no further debate, Representative Andrade, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while I had the opportunity to waive my close on the underlying bill, the substance of this amendment is really the subject of a lot of hard work from my co-sponsor, Representative Roach. So I'd ask that he be able to do his closing from Representative Schoaf's desk.
Representative Roach from Representative Schoaf's desk, you're recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Andrade. And I just want to give a big shout out, big as I can, to Senator Hooper and Senator Boyd, who really give credence to the adage that nothing is dead until the hanky drops. So if they're watching, I want to thank both of them that would not be here with this bill, and these people would be put out of work if it weren't for their efforts in the Senate. I've spoken a lot about the economics here, but this is not the only thing at play. Also, supply lines and the precedent that this sets. And I want to use this opportunity just to talk for a few minutes about this concept that we debate so much in here about home rule. We're on, I believe, the 6th iteration of Florida's Constitution. The most recent one was crafted in 1968. And when they put those home rule powers in 1968, there were about 5 million people in the state of Florida. And you could afford to have a city-by-city or county-by-county regulations. But now, more than 50 years later, in a state with almost 22 million people in there, you simply cannot have a patchwork regulatory framework from city to city to county by county. And just imagine if the voters in Jacksonville, where we import a large portion of the automobiles that populate the southern region of the United States, imagine if the voters in Jacksonville said, you know what, we've got too many cars on the road, we're going to vote to ban the importation of automobiles. Imagine what a destabilizing that would have, not on just on the market, but on supply lines. So I think it's important that our seaports are governed in a uniform statewide manner that's consistent, stable operating environment. We want to continue to encourage the growth of maritime commerce. And if this referendum is allowed to stand, it's going to forever sever Key West citizens from their proud history and heritage of being a working maritime port, and will alter the future of that once great city, which name invokes the idea of freedom for so many. So let's welcome everyone to the state of Florida, and let's put these workers back to work. I ask for your support. Thank you.
All in favor of the motion, say yay. Yay. All opposed, no. No. Show the motion adopted. The question now recurs on final passage of CS for CS for CS. Senate Bill 1194 as amended. The clerk will unlock the machine and the members will proceed to vote. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? The clerk will lock the machine and announce the vote.
75 yeas, 40 nays, Mr. Speaker.
Show the bill passes. Read the next message.
None on the desk, Mr. Speaker.
Members, we will now take up returning messages list number 3. Read the first message.